Hi everyone, welcome to Privacy Now. I'm Mike Fibus. You know, the use of facial recognition in law enforcement has really bubbled to the top of the privacy debate this year. It's a much different discussion than we've been having with regard to our online digital footprint and social media. There's arguably a more legitimate purpose, catching criminals. You might also say that there's a much more potent threat to our privacy. Now, the ACLU has been very active in the discussion at all levels, advocating for and even sponsoring some legislation. And here to talk about this white-hot issue with us, we're fortunate to have Matt Cagle. Matt is Tech and Civil Liberties Attorney at the ACLU in Northern California. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's catch everybody up. The legislation really started in earnest this year in San Francisco. A few cities have followed suit, and we're looking at state and even federal activity.
That's right. That's right. So, for years now, the public has been learning about facial recognition technology, which grants the government an unprecedented power to identify us, to track where we are, where we go, and some products even purport to try to identify how we feel. So having learned more and more about this technology and the sort of unprecedented threat it poses to civil rights and civil liberties, policymakers have started to act. Last fall, the ACLU and our allies in the Bay Area started pulling together a coalition, not just of privacy groups, not just civil rights groups, but groups working on everything from the rights of the homeless to immigrants' rights, to sponsor legislation in San Francisco that draws a line in the sand and says public safety means not deploying an unproven and invasive technology like facial recognition. So that legislation became the law in San Francisco this past May. And now we're seeing other cities replicate that effort, places like Oakland, like Berkeley, cities in Massachusetts. And we're also seeing state legislation, like you said, that would draw a line in the sand on the use of this technology by law enforcement agencies.
Right, and to drive that point home that it's not ready, you had done that study with actually the state legislatures, yes?
That's right. The ACLU this year, we ran the faces of the California legislature against a facial recognition software and tested it to see if the software would identify matches in a mugshot database of people who had been arrested. Using Amazon's product called Recognition, at the default settings, the system produced 26 false matches. Just imagine what a false match could mean in the real world. That could mean a law enforcement officer is misinformed about who you are, your criminal background, and could take steps to engage with a person and potentially use force purely based on mistaken information. That's way too dangerous. We think that one false match is way too many. But studies have shown it's not just Amazon's product. There are many prominent facial recognition products that are suffering from accuracy issues and that are less accurate for people of color and particularly women of color.
Yeah, because of the contrast issues, that will be a perennial problem that they probably will be able to maybe minimize one day. But that brings up a question: it sounds like the ACLU is not saying no; it's saying not now. Is that correct?
Well, what we're doing is we're really listening to voters who oppose facial recognition. We're listening to the experts who are sounding the alarm, and we're listening to the companies building it. Companies like Axon and Microsoft are refusing to provide facial recognition, say, for officer body cameras. And so there's a groundswell of opposition, and policymakers are listening to that. The ACLU is playing a key role as part of these efforts, but we're not the only ones here. This is really a bigger consensus that has emerged that we need to be really, really careful about this technology. In some places, that's going to mean a ban. In some places, that may result in a moratorium, a sort of ban with a time limit on it. But what's really exciting here is that democracies at all levels in the United States are acting to rein this technology in.
Yeah, there's no question, and we've seen what's happened with other forms of our digital footprint. I mean, it's only been 20 years since you could text to somebody in another network, and the NSA has the program of indiscriminate data collection of texts and phone calls. So there's definitely a good reason to kind of catch this now and at least set up parameters. And I guess that's what I was asking. Do you see a path one day to having facial recognition in use with law enforcement and having the public see that as not too invasive?
Well, the reality is that in many places, law enforcement agencies are already using facial recognition. And so these legislative efforts are a response to what we've seen in the real world. You have law enforcement agencies like the New York Police Department misusing facial recognition, running images of celebrities through the system, and then going and arresting the matches produced by the system. You have criminal defendants across the United States who are potentially being kept in the dark about whether facial recognition was used in their cases. And you have companies like Amazon who are marketing systems that not only identify who you are just based on your face in an image, but that promise to identify many people in a crowded room or at a gathering of people. And with that sort of technology and that sort of power, suddenly the government has the ability, with nary lifting a finger, to track large groups of people at a given time, and whether they attend a protest or walk down the street and visit the local doctor's office. So it's really important right now that as law enforcement is rushing to deploy these technologies, that we're having an opportunity to, at a minimum, press pause on whether these technologies can continue to be used.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, and you pointed to some indiscriminate uses. We've already seen what's going on in China with the Uyghurs, and as far as enabling law enforcement, I think more than half of the states in the U.S. actually law enforcement has access to the driver's license databases. So that in a sense kind of puts us in a perennial lineup, if you will.
That's right. So in some states, law enforcement are taking existing photo sets, things like mugshot images of people who have been arrested, or license photos of people who have obtained driver's licenses, and they're creating facial recognition systems built upon those existing databases. That really, in many cases, violates a core principle of how data should be managed. When your government or when a company collects data for one purpose, to give you a license, or because you've been arrested and frankly, you may never be charged, that data shouldn't just be used for a secondary purpose without a real democratic debate about whether our databases of photos should be turned into facial recognition systems that have a massive ability to inflict harm to civil rights and civil liberties.
Yep, agreed. One concern I do have or wonder about is if it is in some sense too late. I mean, Facebook is pretty public and provides a massive database, the driver's license databases. The technology keeps proliferating. Cameras keep getting more widely used and cheaper. Is it too late in some ways, or are you really hopeful that we can sort of rein it in, make it right, and let it go?
I don't think it is too late. I think San Francisco's passage of a facial recognition ban here at the center of technology innovation in the United States and arguably the world shows that it's not too late. And the ripple effects you've seen from that law being passed show that democratic processes, our legislatures at all levels, they're the ones who have significant power to make decisions about whether to unleash a new technology against the public or not. And simply because something is already being used, that doesn't prohibit lawmakers from stepping in and saying, actually we need to press pause, or actually there need to be guardrails around this. So that is often a sort of concern that is put out there that it's happening already and there's nothing we can do. But San Francisco is a perfect example of how that's just not the case.
Yeah, so good point. I know that law enforcement pushes back, and because here's an obvious tool that that could actually put legitimate criminals behind bars. I mean, we have to keep in mind also the loss of privacy for innocent people. But how do you see ever in sort of finding a balance there? Do you think we can?
Facial recognition is not a tool that reliably works, and therefore it's not a tool that makes us safer. We wouldn't allow law enforcement to drive squad cars with tires that always went flat. We wouldn't allow law enforcement officers to use guns that consistently misfired. So why would we allow law enforcement to use a technology that researcher after researcher, test after test, has shown is less accurate for people of color, and that suffers from accuracy issues in many cases? That doesn't make communities safer. And so it's really important to break down the sort of argument being made by proponents of this technology, which is wrong, and which that says, here's a tool, because this is a tool that right now it's broken.
Yeah, no two ways about that. And so maybe rather than us not discriminating, that they're not discriminating between no and not now. That's a good point. Have you ever envisioned, say 5-10 years out in the future, the technology works perfectly, it's out there, how it might be regulated so that there's a balance between law enforcement's goals and our privacy rights?
That's a great point. Someday, facial recognition technology might improve in its accuracy, and some products have already improved. Regardless of how accurate facial recognition is, we should be concerned about the power it gives the government to track people going about their daily lives, to track people as they attend protests or walk down the street, to force you to essentially identify yourself when you walk by a surveillance camera or a law enforcement officer, to force you to give up your anonymity that you enjoy when you walk down the street right now in a city or in the countryside. And even if this were perfectly accurate, we know that the history of surveillance technology, especially powerful surveillance technologies, is a history of these systems being turned against communities of color, being turned against immigrant communities, and being used to criminalize and over-police people. And so it's really important to focus on the inaccuracy issues right now, but remind ourselves that even perfectly accurate facial recognition poses a distinct and broad threat to our civil rights and civil liberties. And then, of course, what we already see in the wild right now is law enforcement agencies misusing facial recognition systems, submitting blurred or altered images of images into these systems to produce matches that lead to investigations of people, failing to provide notice and a consistent explanation to defendants where facial recognition has been used in their cases. So that could be the case even if this technology were perfectly accurate. Humans are still operating these systems, and humans are subject to flaws. Humans misuse systems. Humans have bias. And so it's really important, like you said, to expand beyond just questions of accuracy.
As I try and envision a world that's fair and has facial recognition, if maybe there's that data is not accessible without a warrant, for example, have you explored that direction at all? Any sort of legal avenue where we might have these data streams and still have privacy?
Well, right now, what we're seeing is communities and legislatures wanting to at least press pause and clear a space so that there could be a democratic debate about whether facial recognition should ever be used in particular contexts. One of the areas where this debate is happening is with police body cameras. Um, Police body cameras, as many viewers know, were promised as a way to hold officers accountable, to make sure that communities can know what the police are doing in their names. But what we're seeing is a movement towards wanting to add facial recognition to these systems that would transform and corrupt these body cameras so that they're no longer just officer accountability tools, but they're instead focused on the community for surveillance, which would break the promise of those technologies. So I think what you're going to see are legislative fixes that seek to take facial recognition off the table for particular uses. Body cameras were never promised for surveillance of the community. They shouldn't be used for that. And that's why in California right now, there's a bill pending called AB 1215 that would take facial recognition off the table for body cameras.
Right, and that makes sense. That's the use case I was more thinking about were, the inevitable cameras on street corners and street lights, so that, where we have the expectation of privacy, there is a camera, data being captured and stored somewhere. And if that happens, how do we still have privacy?
What's going to be most important is that the people who are subject to potential surveillance are at the table and their elected leaders are speaking for them and giving them a chance to speak when decisions about facial recognition are made. What's so great about what happened in San Francisco is that a coalition of civil rights organizations and community groups spanning the gamut of communities and different backgrounds of people came together and said, this is what we want in our community. The most important thing is that when there's that chance of a city surveillance camera network being equipped with facial recognition, that it doesn't happen in secret, that it doesn't happen solely because police want it to happen, and that it doesn't happen solely because a surveillance company makes a sales pitch to police department. What's important is that the community be in charge and the community make the decisions about whether and how that technology can ever be used.
Okay, makes sense. Matt, I know we're almost out of time. What can't you believe I didn't ask you today?
I think you hit the questions really well. We talked about the general threats. We talked about, quick reference to the body camera bill. We talked about accurate or inaccurate, which I think is a really smart point of yours. And, how democracy should be driving this conversation, which is what's really exciting about San Francisco and these other communities. So I can't think of a point that that we didn't hit. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Matt, and thank you all for joining us. Until next time, bye-bye.